If you can properly plan for a responding section question, you're halfway there to producing the best essay you've ever written.
Everything you need to easily pass English ATAR. English ATAR made simple. Powered by Saints Coaching.
Hello, we're talking all about planning your response to your responding section question, your essay in this lesson. By this stage, you would have done the equivalent lesson on planning in Module 3 about the comprehending section. In that lesson, I said there's a difference in the way you plan for comprehending, responding, and composing section questions. The differences might look relatively minor, but they can have some pretty big implications if you're not aware of them. If you haven't completed the planning lesson in Module 3, and for that matter, all of Module 3, I highly recommend you do that before continuing with this lesson, as those prior lessons lay the foundation for what we are going to learn in this one. A final note before we get started. This lesson will be analyzing 4 different texts, and it's highly unlikely that you are studying them at the moment. I wouldn't blame you if you just zoned out at a point where I was discussing a specific text, because that text doesn't apply to you. Please don't make that mistake. The texts that are analyzed in this lesson and the information that's discussed in relation to them illustrate how you can complete the responding section planning steps in relation to the 2 texts that you have studied. All right, that's enough chit chat from me. Let's do this. Lesson objectives. We'll discuss a side note about comparison questions. Then we'll apply the planning steps to pass WACE exam questions, analyze example 1, 2, and 3. Then we'll compare the planning steps, underscore the similarities and differences, illustrate the similarities and differences with an example, and then outline a simple summary. So, a side note about comparison questions. Firstly, what are they? Comparison questions are questions in the responding section that require you to compare 2 texts in the same response. These matter because every single WACE exam between 2016 and 2022 has had at least one comparison question in the responding section. For example, this one was in 2016. Compare the effectiveness of the endings of 2 texts to position their audience to respond strongly to their themes or ideas. 2017, compare how 2 texts have been constructed for similar purposes but through different genres. 2018, compare how 2 texts of different modes use textual features to represent a similar idea or theme. 2019, compare how 2 texts created in different modes use language features to invite empathy for a particular individual or group. 2020, what a shit year. Compare 2 texts of the same genre to show how they are stylistically different. 2021, compare how at least 2 texts use different styles to captivate or surprise you. And 2022, compare how 2 texts' treatment of a similar theme, issue, or idea was shaped by their context. So, these are comparison questions. What is my advice in relation to them? It's a trap! Why is it a trap? Firstly, practice makes perfect. Think about all the essays you've written in English at school. How many of those essays required you to compare 2 texts? How many of them required you to analyze 1 text? I'm guessing the answer to that second question is significantly higher than the answer to the first one. If this is the case, you've had much more practice writing an essay about 1 text than 2. Almost all of the time, more practice means better marks. Here's the second reason why comparison questions are a trap. It's easier to juggle 1 ball than 2. Analyzing 1 text is easier than analyzing 2 texts, just like it's easier to juggle 1 ball than 2. You see? Don't overcomplicate essay writing and just focus on analyzing 1 text well rather than 2 texts poorly. Those are 2 reasons why I would advise against choosing a comparison question in the responding section. But there is an exception for when it is perfectly acceptable to answer these questions. That exception can be summarized as follows. You can already juggle 2 balls proficiently. What I mean by this is, if you've consistently received good marks for comparison questions in a responding section style assessment, and you believe you can replicate those marks in an exam, then go for it. If you happen to be one of the few whom this exception applies to, don't worry, this module will still be useful. We'll be looking at a few comparison questions, and there'll be opportunities to answer practice comparison questions as well. With all of that said, here is a key takeaway for comparison questions. Avoid them unless you're good at them. Okay, let's get to the juicy, succulent, meaty part of this lesson. As we apply these planning steps, I'd like you to bear in the back of your mind how these planning steps for responding section questions are different and similar to the planning steps we learnt about in Module 3. Here is example number 1. The question is, discuss how you developed a more considered interpretation of a text by reflecting on at least one different reading of it. FYI, we analysed this question but a different text in the lesson in Module 2 called Your Reading, Interpretation and Response. So if the question sounds familiar, that is why. Our sample text for this question is Pretty Woman, one of the classic rom-com movies of all time. The trailer to the movie is linked in the resources tab below the video. Go check it out. Come back once you're done. How should we plan for the question? Our first step is underline key parts, and the first key part we will underline is how. Then you, then developed, then more considered, interpretation, reflecting, different reading. Moving on to step number 2, which is defining those key parts, and the first key part is how. We know from the lesson on language features in Module 2 that how just refers to language features, but if you really wanted to impress the marker for this question, you would be referring to, or at least thinking of, those 9 factors that influence your reading of a text when you see the word how in this question, because one of the main elements of it is this concept of reading. Some of those 9 factors include context, perspectives, values and attitudes, genre expectations, and language features. Moving on to the next key part of the question, which is the word you, and we know from the relevant lesson in Module 2 that this is an invitation to write in the first person, meaning you should use words like me, my, and I. Next, we have the word developed. A synonym for this is just arrived at. Then we have the term more considered, and this just means something that's been thought about carefully, or it's more refined, thought over. We also learnt in that lesson about interpretations that this concept just refers to the meaning that I make of a text. Turning to the word reflecting, some synonyms: contemplating, thinking, ruminating. Last but not least, this term different reading. Reading is just a process of making meaning of a text. Therefore, a different reading could be a process of making meaning of a text other than your own. This is really saying we're looking at a text through a different lens, like these ones. That is step number 2 done. Now let's look at rewording the question, step number 3. Here's the original version of the question, and this is the reworded version of the question. We've swapped out the word developed for arrived at, a text to the name of the text, and then reflecting on to thinking about. So the reworded version of the question reads, discuss how you arrived at a more considered interpretation of Pretty Woman by thinking about at least one different reading of it. For me, this reworded version probably sounds 5 to 10% clearer. Step number 4 is diagram the elements. So this is our question, and here are our main elements. We have original interpretation and then more considered interpretation. This one underlined part of the question actually contains 2 elements, because in order for me to prove that I have arrived at a more considered interpretation, I need to explain what my original interpretation was in the first place. Otherwise, it would be hard for me to justify how my more considered interpretation is in fact more considered if there is nothing to compare it to. But wait, there is another element, and that is how I arrived at the more considered interpretation. This part of my discussion must say that I've arrived at the more considered interpretation in relation to considering at least one different reading. So these are our elements. This is what they look like in diagram form. Moving on to step number 5, which is complete the diagram. Looking at this element of the diagram first, the original interpretation part, I could say my original interpretation is that Pretty Woman is about a strong female protagonist who embarks on a journey of self-empowerment. This original interpretation could lead to the following more considered interpretation. Pretty Woman suggests that women need wealthy men to transform themselves. The final element refers to how I arrived at this more considered interpretation. And of those 9 factors that influence your reading of a text, I'll be discussing the following 3. context of production and reception, generic conventions of romantic comedies, and finally the technical construction of the film, which is really just referring to visual, language, and stylistic features. So that is our diagram. Now I want you to consider how this information manifests in the following structure. And that, of course, refers to our sixth and final step, which is determine structure. My thesis is I developed a more considered interpretation of Pretty Woman by reflecting on a feminist reading of it. My first body paragraph will be discussing context, and specifically it will be referring to the following textual evidence, which is Vivian's argument with Edward after watching Polo. Specifically, I'll discuss context of production in relation to this piece of evidence. Then for my next piece of textual evidence, I'll discuss the difference in how Vivian is treated before and after her makeover. And regarding this piece of textual evidence, I'll discuss context of reception. For body paragraph number 2, I'll be discussing generic conventions. My first piece of textual evidence will discuss how the text blurs the traditional gender roles in rom-coms. In Pretty Woman, the main characters' similarities are highlighted, namely that they both screw people for money. Another convention that will be discussed is the conventional happily ever after ending of rom-coms, which usually relates to some sort of damsel in distress being saved. The third and final body paragraph will be focusing on characterization and visual language features. One piece of textual evidence relates to the subversion of assumptions and stereotypes relating to sex workers. There's one scene in the movie where the man, Edward, catches the woman, Vivian, in the bathroom. Edward thinks that Vivian is getting drugs out of her purse, where in fact she's actually just getting some floss. Another piece of textual evidence relates to the characterization of Vivian in the opening scene of the film. She is objectified in this scene, and this really sets the tone for the rest of the movie. That is example number 1. Let's move on to example number 2. This is our question. Explain how at least one text has transformed or adapted genre to alter an audience's attitude towards an issue or concept. Our sample text for this one is Everything Everywhere All at Once. This movie became an instant favorite of mine the moment I saw it, and brings me a nerdy amount of joy that we're analyzing it in this course. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you do. I guarantee you'll have some good laughs. Also, it's the text that we'll be referring to the most in this module, so it wouldn't hurt to see it for that purpose as well. Go and check out the trailer, which is linked in the resources tab below the video for a little teaser, and I'll see you once you're back. Let's plan for this question. We know the drill. Firstly, let's underline the key parts of it, starting with, surprise, surprise, the word how. Then we'll look at transformed or adapted, then genre, alter, and audiences, attitude, an issue or concept. Moving to step number 2, define key parts of the question. Looking at how, firstly, we can look at language features, generic conventions, structural features, all of those main concepts that we looked at in the front end of Module 2. Turning to transformed or adapted, the word transformed means to change the form of, and the word adapted means to make something suitable for a new purpose. Importantly, the word or means that we should choose one or the other, not both. Then looking at genre, we know from the relevant lesson that genre just means a kind of either subject matter or form and structure. The question refers to the concept of genre generally as a collective noun. See the bonus lesson at the end of Module 2 for what collective nouns are. Basically, this means we can discuss more than one genre of subject matter, such as sci-fi and fantasy. Next key part of the question is the word alter. This means to change in a relatively small but nonetheless significant way. Then we have an audiences, which means we should specify a specific audience. We could just get away with saying the audience, but here the term an audience is hinting at the fact that we should specify who the audience is. Turning to the word attitude, we know from the relevant lesson in Module 2 that this is just a specific feeling about something. The something in this case will be an issue or concept depending on which one you choose. And that brings us to our final key part of this question, which is an issue or concept. An issue is a personal or public concern that is in dispute or considered to be a problem, and a concept is an abstract notion. Once again, the word or means that we should choose issue or concept, not both. Turning to step number 3, which is reword the question, we're going from this original version to the following reworded version. From, explain how at least one text has transformed or adapted genre to alter an audience's attitude towards an issue or concept, to explain how EAAO has transformed genre to change an audience's attitude towards a concept. Still a mouthful, but not as much of a mouthful compared to the original version. In the reworded version, I've obviously decided to choose transform rather than adapted, and I've also decided to look at a concept rather than an issue. Moving on to step number 4, diagram the elements. First main element of the question is this part of it, how the text has transformed genre. Next main part of the question is change an audience's attitude. Final main part of the question is a concept. All of these elements in diagram form look like the following. We go from how everything everywhere has transformed genre to change an audience's attitude to a concept. Let's see what those different elements look like in a completed diagram. Starting with how everything everywhere has transformed genre. The first thing we'd want to map out here is what the potential genres of subject matter of everything everywhere are, and they could include sci-fi, action, comedy, adventure, drama, romance, coming of age, or sci for bad Linux. From there, we'd want to flesh out how everything everywhere transforms one or more of those genres. One way it does this is through its absurdist style. An absurdist style is an intentionally ridiculous or bizarre style, and it's pretty safe to say everything everywhere ticks this box through its clothing, the motif of the everything bagel, this idea of verse jumping, and hot dog fingers. It also transforms genre through its emotional intensity, specifically Evelyn, who is the protagonist, and her strained relationship with her daughter, her husband, and her father. Lastly, the movie transforms genre through its structural elements. Specifically, it has embedded stories, such as the use of a fake end credit scene. It uses shifts in time and place, circularity. The title is used to structure the film in 3 different parts, and it has shifting aspect ratios. So that is how everything everywhere transforms genre. Now let's look at the change an audience's attitude part of the question. Again, looking at the nuances of this question, the word change implies that one thing is going from an original state to a changed state. So the relevant concept we're looking at is absurdism. And in this column, we want to state what the original attitude towards absurdism is, and then what the changed attitude towards absurdism is. The original one is one of rejection and disapproval, and the altered or changed attitude towards absurdism is one of curiosity and being uplifted. As I just mentioned, our concept is absurdism. This is not the same as an absurdist style. The concept of absurdism refers to the belief that human beings exist in a purposeless, chaotic universe. That is our completed diagram. Now let's check out our 6th and final step, which is determine structure. Here is the thesis. Everything everywhere all at once has transformed the science fiction genre through its absurdist style, emotional intensity, and manipulation of structural elements to change sci-fi enthusiasts' disapproving attitude towards absurdism. Body paragraph 1 will discuss the absurdist style in relation to the following textual evidence: Jobu Tupaki's clothing, the everything bagel, and finally, verse jumping. Body paragraph 2 will look at the emotional intensity of the movie, and it'll look at the following textual evidence: Evelyn's relationship with her husband, then the relationship with her daughter, and finally, Evelyn's relationship with her father. Last but not least, we have body paragraph 3, which is all about structural elements. Textual evidence is firstly the embedded story, how there are fake end credits. Then we'll look at the title being used to structure the film in 3 parts. And finally, we'll look at shifts in time and place. Bearing in mind that the main focus of each body paragraph is how everything everywhere has transformed genre. For this body paragraph, I'm saying everything everywhere has transformed genre through its use of structural elements. Example number 2. Done and dusted. Let's do our 3rd and final example. The relevant question is as follows. Compare how 2 texts of different modes use textual features to represent a similar idea or theme. Here are our relevant texts. We have the book Snow Crash, written by Neil Stephenson, came out in 1992. And we also have the movie Arrival, directed by Denis Villeneuve, came out 2016. You might recall that Neil Stephenson in the book Snow Crash was the dude who coined the term the metaverse. This movie, Arrival, is another one of my favorites. Both texts are linked in the resources tab below the video. The link to Snow Crash is just a link to the Amazon product page. You don't have to buy it or read it, but you can if you want to. And the link for Arrival is to the trailer. Go and give the trailer to Arrival a watch and come back once you're done. Let's plan for this final question. First step is underline key parts of it, and the first part we should be looking at is the word compare. Then how different modes, textual features represent similar idea or theme. Turning to step number 2, defining those key parts of the question. The word compare means we should be looking at the similarities and or differences. The word how refers to textual features. Different modes refers to the written, visual, auditory, or multimodal modes. Remember, in the lesson on mode and medium in Module 2, 2 texts will be of different modes as long as they don't share the exact same 2 or 3 modes. For example, if we're analyzing a photograph and a movie, the photograph uses the visual mode and the movie uses the visual mode and the auditory mode, meaning the movie is multimodal. In this case, the photograph and the movie would be of different modes because the photograph uses the visual mode and doesn't use the auditory mode. It isn't multimodal like the movie is, therefore they're of different modes. So with this in mind, Snow Crash and Arrival are definitely of different modes. The textual features part of the question just refers to language features, generic conventions, structural devices, all of that jazz. Then the word represent, as we know from that lesson on representations, just means to represent something. And finally, similar idea or theme. The word idea refers to the specific comment a text makes about a concept, theme, or issue. The theme is a recurring and underlying element that a text creator explores in a text. And finally, the word or means we must choose an idea or a theme, but not an idea and a theme. Step number 3 is rewording the question. We go from this original to this reworded version. What we've done here is substitute the words to text for the actual text names that we're comparing, Snow Crash and Arrival. And then I've omitted the words idea or because I've chosen to compare how both texts represent a similar theme. Turning to step number 4, diagram the elements. Our first element is the word compare. Our second one is how Snow Crash and Arrival use textual features. And our final element is this part of it, a similar theme. All of these elements in the question look like this in diagram form. We go from compare to how Snow Crash and Arrival use textual features to represent a similar theme. Step number 5, diagram the elements. This is what those elements look like in diagram form. Starting with a discussion of how Snow Crash uses textual features. We've got analogies between the spoken language and other information systems. There's a reference to Snow Crash being a drug, a virus, and a religion all at once. There's also the symbolism of bodily fluids in the text and how bodily fluids is like a transmission of information from one vessel to another. Finally, there's also the setting, and the setting is the metaverse, which really is just computer code, and computer code is a form of language. So these textual features are used to represent the theme of encoding information. That is all of the relevant information on Snow Crash. Now let's take a look at the relevant info on Arrival. Here, we're looking at how Arrival uses textual features. Firstly, we could discuss the narration of Louise Banks, who is the protagonist, and she is played by Amy Adams. Louise says the following in the movie: "I used to think this was the beginning of your story. Memory is a strange thing. It doesn't work like I thought it did. We are so bound by time, by its order. But now I'm not so sure I believe in beginnings and endings." That is the narration. We could also have a look at the circular structure of the movie. Specifically, I could discuss how lighting is used to depict Louise, and also how the montage of Louise with her daughter is used in the opening scene. Finally, could discuss the symbolism of geometric shapes in Arrival. Specifically, I could discuss the structure, order, and linearity of Louise's life, plus the symbolism of the birdcage, which, if you've seen the movie, you'll hopefully remember what I'm talking about, versus the circular shapes used by the heptapods, which are the aliens, and the cyclical nature of those shapes. Again, I want to stress what I said earlier. A lot of this information might not make any sense to you, especially if you've not read or seen either of the texts. The point that I want you to take from this exercise is how I am planning information in relation to the texts. Think about how you could be doing the same thing in relation to the two texts that you've studied. So this is how Arrival uses textual features, and the similar theme in this case is language and cognition. Both text themes are similar, satisfying this part of the question because they both refer to language. That is step number 5. Let's take a look at the final step, determine structure, step number 6. Once again, I want you to consider how the information we just looked at in that diagram manifests in the following scaffold. The thesis for this response could be Snow Crash and Arrival use textual features to represent similar themes pertaining to language. Body paragraph 1 could focus on a difference and specifically the analogies between language and information systems in Snow Crash versus the narration of Louise Banks in Arrival. In relation to this body paragraph, the first piece of textual evidence would relate to Snow Crash and the second piece of textual evidence would relate to Arrival. Moving to my second body paragraph, this would now discuss a similarity between both texts, whereas the first body paragraph discussed a difference. The similarity is how both texts use symbolism. Snow Crash has symbolism of bodily fluids, whereas Arrival has symbolism of geometric shapes. Once again, one piece of textual evidence would relate to Snow Crash, the other piece of textual evidence would relate to Arrival. Switching again to body paragraph 3, this would discuss a difference. Specifically, Snow Crash and its focus on the metaverse versus Arrival and its circular structure. One piece of textual evidence would discuss the construction of the metaverse in Snow Crash, and the other piece of textual evidence would discuss the use of a circular narrative structure in Arrival. And that wraps up our discussion of applying the planning steps to past WACE exam questions. Now let's compare the planning steps from the comprehending section to the planning steps in the responding section. How are they similar and how are they different? Hopefully you noticed that step 1, underline key parts of the question, was the same across both sections. For both the comprehending section and responding section, step 1 requires you to identify the words in the question that you need to understand and address. The same thing can be said about step 2, defining those key parts of the question. They're the same for the comprehending section and the responding section. In both sections, you should jot down a brief explanation of what those words mean and or write some synonyms for words in the question that you're not sure of. Another similarity for both sections is step 3, rewording the question. Here, in both sections, you should replace any words in the question that you don't fully understand with synonyms and or rearrange the syntax of the question, the sentence structure of the question, so the relationship between concepts is more clear. This is where things start to vary a little bit at step 4, diagram the elements. For the comprehending section, you should identify 2 main elements in the question and then show how those main elements relate to one another with an arrow. For the responding section though, there is more often 3 elements than 2. So here we're identifying the 3 main elements in the question and we're showing how they relate to one another with an arrow or arrows. Step number 5 is complete the diagram. In the comprehending section, this involves identifying textual evidence and then explaining how the textual evidence is relevant to one or more elements in the diagram. And you should do this with minimal detail. Minimal detail because it's an unseen text and you haven't had time to study it beforehand. Plus, you've only got 30 minutes to write a given response. On the other hand, in the responding section, you should identify textual evidence and explain how it's relevant to 2 or more elements in the diagram, and this should be a bit more detailed. It should be a bit more detailed for the inverse reasoning of why the comprehending step 5 has minimal detail. In the responding section, you've got at least 60 minutes to write this response, plus you've had time to study the text before the exam. Step number 6 is once again different between both sections. Hopefully you notice this difference as we're going through those planning steps. In the comprehending section, you should determine how many paragraphs your response will be. In the responding section though, you should determine your thesis, the topic sentence of each body paragraph, and the textual evidence that will be analyzed in each body paragraph. So those are all the similarities and differences. Here is a summary of that comparison. Overall, we can say that the planning steps consist of 6 steps and all 6 are completed in both sections. Steps 1 to 3 are completed similarly in both sections, but steps 4 to 6 are completed differently in both sections. Focusing on these 3 different steps that are completed differently in both sections, regarding step 4, firstly, which is diagram the elements. In the comprehending section, as we saw, the question typically contains 2 main elements, whereas in the responding section, the question typically contains 3 main elements. For step number 5, which is completing the diagram, in the comprehending section, the diagram contains minimal detail, but in the responding section, it contains a bit more detail. Finally, step number 6, determine structure. Comprehending section, determine the number of paragraphs, but in the responding section, you should determine the thesis, the topic of each body paragraph, and the textual evidence that will be analyzed in each body paragraph. If we're to summarize this even further, we could say that ultimately, steps 4 to 6 in the responding section are more detailed because of the following. 1, you've got 60 minutes to answer the question in the responding section, and 2, the responding section is worth 40% of the exam. This is compared to, of course, the 30% weighting of the comprehending section. So what we're saying here is that it's worth spending a little bit more time on your plan for the responding section because it's weighted 10% more. And here is one final point to summarize the similarities and differences between the planning steps of the comprehending section and the responding section. It is a key takeaway. Steps 4 to 6 of the planning steps are completed differently in the responding section. Our final subtopic of this lesson is an example of the similarities and differences. In the PDF study notes, there's a big table that demonstrates how the first 3 planning steps are completed similarly and how the final 3 planning steps are completed differently across the comprehending section questions and responding section questions. We've already looked at the plans for those respective questions. The comprehending section question we looked at in the lesson on planning, and the responding section question we just looked at a few minutes ago. I'm not going to go through every bit of info in those tables in this lesson because it's pretty fresh, but I encourage you to pause the video now and have a skim of that table so you can directly see the similarities and differences in actual examples. Hopefully, you notice the following differences in relation to steps 4 to 6 of those questions. Here's step 4 from the example table, and we can see that step 4 for the comprehending section, there are 2 elements. Once again, for the responding section, there are 3 elements. This is step 5 from the table. For the comprehending section, there is minimal detail in the table, whereas for the responding section, as we can see, there's a bit more detail. Finally, here is step number 6 for the example table. As we can see, for the comprehending section, we just need to determine the number of paragraphs, and we do that by asking ourselves, does my response shift focus? In this question, in module 3, we determined the response doesn't shift focus, so therefore it'll just be one long paragraph. For step 6 in the responding section planning steps, it's a bit different. We should determine the thesis, the topic of each body paragraph, and the textual evidence that will be analyzed in each body paragraph, and that is what we did in step 6 of this example here. Based on this example, we can see that step 6 is probably the step that is most different across the comprehending section and the responding sections. That is everything for this lesson. Let's simply summarize it. In the first part of the lesson, we discussed a side note about comparison questions. Comparison questions are questions in the responding section that require you to compare 2 texts in the same response. For example, compare the effectiveness of the endings of 2 texts to position their audience to respond strongly to their themes or ideas, and that is from the 2016 WACE exam. My advice is to avoid those questions unless you're good at them, because firstly, you probably had more practice writing essays about 1 text than 2, and more practice typically results in better marks. That's the first reason. The second reason is analyzing 1 text is easier than analyzing 2. From there, the main part of this lesson was applying the planning steps to pass WACE exam questions, and we did that in relation to examples 1, 2, and 3. After that part of the lesson, we looked at comparing the planning steps. Here, we saw that steps 4 to 6 of the planning steps are completed differently in the responding section. Focusing specifically on those main differences regarding step 4, which is diagram the elements, in the comprehending section, the question typically contains contains 2 main elements, whereas in the responding section, the question typically contains 3 main elements. Regarding step 5, which is complete the diagram, in the comprehending section, the diagram contains minimal detail, whereas in the responding section, the diagram contains a bit more detail. Finally, step number 6, determine structure. Comprehending section, this involves determining the number of paragraphs, whereas in the responding section, this means you should determine the thesis, topic of each BP, and the textual evidence you'll be analyzing in each BP. A few final things to note about this section of the lesson. Compared to the comprehending section, the last 3 steps of the planning steps in the responding section are more detailed because, firstly, you have more time to answer one question in the responding section, and secondly, the responding section is worth 40% of the exam. Final part of this lesson, we looked at an example of the similarities and differences between the planning steps. The full comparison table that illustrates the similarities and differences in an actual example of the planning steps in the comprehending section and the planning steps in the responding section is in the PDF study notes. And we are done for this lesson. One final thing before I shut up. With all the plans you completed in Module 3 and with the plans that you will be completing in Module 4, you probably noticed that steps 1 to 3 are not as helpful as completing steps 4 to 6. As you practice completing the planning steps more and more, you'll probably notice you start to spend less and less time on those first 3 steps because you would have gotten to a point where you only need to underline and define 1 or 2 words. That means that you're actually getting a really good natural understanding of all of the terms in the question, and that's a great thing. It means you're getting the hang of it. If you haven't gotten to that point yet, don't worry, there is plenty more practice in this module. And on the topic of practice, the PDF activities for this lesson get you to complete 3 plans to 3 different past WACE exam questions. As with the equivalent activities in Module 3, completing these activities represents the foundation for completing the remaining lessons in this module. So make sure you get these activities for this lesson done following the instructions. You'll also see in the PDF activities what a handwritten plan that uses these planning steps looks like. That is all from me. Looking forward to seeing you in the next one, which is on structure. I have a feeling that you're going to find that one very useful. Until then, keep it simple.